Welcome, everyone, to the third annual LogiCal-LA conference. So let's be clear about what this conference is about, and what exactly is scientific skepticism. Briefly stated by Paul Kurtz, one of the giants of scientific skepticism, a skeptic is one who is willing to question any claim to truth, asking for clarity in definition, consistency and logic, and adequacy of evidence. The use of skepticism is thus an essential part of objective scientific inquiry and the search for reliable knowledge. Carl Sagan said, "Science is a way of skeptically interrogating the universe with a fine understanding of human fallibility. If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those of authority, then we're up for grabs for the next charlatan, political or religious, who comes ambling along." At the heart of this movement is the quest for truth using scientific inquiry. With so much pseudoscience, we need a methodology that can be used to tell us not if a claim is 100% true, but to examine if a claim is most likely true. In other words, to provisionally believe a claim is true until more compelling evidence is presented. Science and scientific research can and will improve our understanding of social issues as well. But there is one issue that is overriding all of these issues. It's climate change. We are placing the human race in a precarious position for future generations as we ignore the prognosis of the world as a whole. As the SGU, Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, said several weeks ago on one of their podcasts, this generation is the one who must start to change our planet. It will be much more difficult for the future generations to make a significant change without doubling or tripling the cost to make that change. And most of the current world issues will diminish because all efforts will be placed on saving our planet. We should help other carbon-intensive countries change to a carbon-neutral energy sources. We hope you enjoy the stimulating lectures that our speakers have to offer.
It's time for me to just, I might be looking at some of your thoughts later, just really quick. Okay? I might be, if I have time. But before I do that, just real quick, I want to try and send all of you one of my thoughts, just to see who can work on rapport with the medium, okay? So what I want you to do, when you say to people that you're a thought reader, they get all tense, and I could see that. People are like, no, don't talk to me, don't tell me anything. So first thing I want you to do is take a deep cleansing breath. And I want to see your shoulders relax. I want to see, because this is just for fun. Don't take it too seriously. Like, I would not point to somebody and then tell the rest of the room something that was really embarrassing about that person, Unless it was really funny, then I might do that, but no. I'm just going to try and send you a thought first, just to show you the kind of work that I do. So, listen very carefully. Here's how it's going to work. I want everyone in the room to think of a number between 0 and 50. Both of the digits are odd, and both of the digits are different. So here, I'm going to send it out right now. Okay, I sent it out as big and as bold as I could. How many people immediately saw the number 37? Raise your hand. That's pretty good. 35 over here? That was you. It was you. 35. That was bounced around a little bit. Anyway, so what do you see this stuff every day at work? I mean, it's okay. I know you're skeptics, all right? Of course. But this is the sort of thing that passes for science in some realms of entertainment, okay? Yeah, you can talk about it at lunch.
Do his thing, and I'm going to get the PowerPoint ready.
We're going to do John's trivia question here. Oh, wait, no, John did not want to do his trivia question. He wants to move right into it. John, where are you? Oh, right in front of me. Okay, that's all right. And so without any further ado, Dr. John Eigenauer.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Good luck.
Well, I hate to disappoint you, but I won't be talking about superstition. It's not on the agenda today. My apologies. I don't know how that got miscommunicated. My name's John Eigenauer. I'm a professor of philosophy. I teach critical thinking all day long. I teach teachers how to teach critical thinking. I always do my jury duty, and I'm going to tell you how to get out of it. Yeah, sorry, I have to. You show up at jury duty and they ask you what you do for a living. Say, I'm a professor of philosophy and I teach critical thinking. You're gone immediately. Sorry, but it happens. It happens. I'm actually going to be talking about irrationality today, and I stole my title from a conversation that I had with a colleague of mine. We were talking about our students, of course, and the problem of them not being rational people, and he joked, isn't there an app for that? And that's not the focus of my talk, but the idea is there are a whole bunch of things that get in the way of being rational people, and rationality and irrationality becoming part of social awareness. And today's talk is going to attempt to answer the question, why is it that this big problem, irrationality, doesn't ever make its way into the social sphere so that it becomes a social problem? And that's one of the reasons, because of technological solutionism, but we'll get to that. Now, just in case there are any economists in the audience here, I need to clear up that we talk about irrationality in two terms. The first is called instrumental rationality. And instrumental rationality essentially means if you're doing anything that you think will further your own agenda and get you what you want, such as perform some act of crime to get some money, that's deemed to be rational in an instrumental way. That is, it brings you what you want. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about epistemic rationality, which is evidence-based reasoning. In other words, there's no good evidence that committing a crime will probably pay off, and so we're going to stick with epistemic rationality. They're tough words, but that's what we mean by it. Now, to start making some questions that you guys can help me out with, I want to hear your opinions. So shout out your answer. Just read the question really fast and answer yes or no. Ready? No. Ready for the next one? Yes. Ready for the next one? Yes. Had to think about that one, didn't you? Because you weren't sure what they were. Next, yeah, you'll need some evidence for that. I'll hopefully do that. Next? Yes. Okay, so you can see we've got problem on a personal level and also on a social level. The question is, why don't we think it's a problem? I want to ask you how big a problem you think it is. Because there are people out there that think irrationality is way up on the list in terms of social problems. Now, I don't know if Michael Huemer is exaggerating or not, and that might be a bit of an exaggeration that you're reading up there. But nonetheless, it keys us into the idea that this is really a big problem. In fact, if we start to look at the social costs of irrationality, you can see some of the fields where the social costs become immediately apparent. You remember the global finance meltdown prior to 2010. And of course, we've talked about environmental problems today because of rationality. And obviously, oh, there's the word superstition. That was it, just that one word. Okay, so that's superstition. But even on a personal level, obviously, it's a tremendous problem. Today's presentation, I want to try to answer that question of why irrationality is not attacked or solved. And I'm going to give you 5 reasons. So I'm going to give you 5 bullet points here, and then the rest of the presentation is going to be drilling down into these bullet points of why it is we're not taking this seriously as a society and trying to solve it as a society. And the first is, when we look at the nature of social problems, irrationality doesn't appear to be like what a normal social problem is. The second is, our own brains get in the way of trying to solve the problem of human irrationality. The third one is our over-reliance on technology and the belief that it's going to solve something. That was the title of the presentation. The fourth one, and the one I think is the most interesting one, is that we confuse irrationality with lack of intelligence or rationality with intelligence. And the fourth one points the finger back at me and other educators that there aren't really adequate methods and structures to make sure that young people are really being not just taught material, but taught to be rational people. Okay, so let's get to the first one. The first one, again, is that irrationality is unlike normal social problems. So let's dig down into this. When I started my research on this about 2 years ago, of course, I did what all quality researchers do. I Googled, irrationality is a social problem. You want to guess how many hits I got? 0. The phrase does not appear on the internet. And the internet is what? About the size of the universe? It did not appear on the internet. I found that absolutely striking. Since then, it appears a couple times in an article that I wrote. That's what you're seeing down there. And the article got published in the International Journal of Educational Reform, so that's why the IJER is up there. So I needed some points of comparison. Like, if irrationality as a social problem is not appearing, what is appearing? Well, I learned, for example, that airliners are unsafe. Appeared 373 times. I didn't put airplanes. I intentionally chose airliners because of an obscure word. That appears 373 times. Green tea makes you fart appears almost 3,000 times. President Obama, one point, I thought that'd be a bigger number, really, than I. And remember, this includes things like it's crazy to think that green tea makes you fart. So there might be some negative there. Rabbits are dangerous outnumbered President Obama. And my personal favorite, everything happens for a reason, came back 8 million times. That's 8 million times too many, of course. So now, again, the question is, if this is such a problem, why is it that we are not trying to combat it? The answer seems to be, when you look at these other kinds of social problems, from unemployment down to addiction, it doesn't seem to be like that. Because when you look at most social problems attack populations. You say things like, well, coal miners have horrible working conditions, let's try to improve the horrible working conditions of coal miners, et cetera, et cetera. But irrationality isn't like that. It doesn't affect a small sector of the population. It affects everyone, including the really smart, rational people in this room and me. And so it's a kind of problem that people almost would not want to admit because it's so broad and because it's so widespread. I know that sounds odd. It's counterintuitive. It's so big you don't want to deal with it, but I mean, think of the last argument you had with your spouse, right? It's so big you don't want to deal with it, and so you go to bed and you forget about it. It's the same kind of thing going on. Now, I want to look now at social problems, how they've been looked at in the past, because it's changed, and this helps us understand why it is that irrationality is not coming into the social ken of where we look at things. Up until about the 1980s or so, social problems were thought to be judged by objective considerations. What that means is people thought, this is a social problem because, item number 1, it affects a lot of people. Number 2, it's causing a lot of suffering. Number 3, it can be dealt with in a cost-efficient way. So they were thinking, okay, what is it that makes this a social problem? Oh, it's because we're all sitting down rationally thinking about it, it's harming lots of people, it's causing a lot of suffering, and we can get our hands around it. It turns out in the last 30 or 40 years that they have figured out that this is a completely inadequate model for answering the question about social problems. As a matter of fact, social problems are now deemed, in the last 30 or 40 years, to react in a competitive model way. So you think of something sort of Darwinian. That is, there's not much space out there for you and I to listen. Commercials that we're turning off, some radio time, billboards, etc. That's a really limited space to advertise, we have a problem with fill in the blank, incarceration, homelessness, etc. And so grabbing attention, that space for grabbing attention is really limited. And then you take that space and you filter it down even more based upon cultural and social priorities, and you've got a really, really narrow band. So you look at the problems of coal miners in West Virginia, and nobody really in Orange County cares. And needless to say, people who are working in coal mines in West Virginia don't particularly care about the problems that come up here in Orange County. That's filtering it down on a cultural and a social level. And so if this competitive model is teaching us that there's a really, really narrow spectrum and a narrow window to get things into the social public consciousness, what needs to be done? Well, interestingly, irrationality doesn't have much of a chance because, frankly, it ain't very sexy. And it turns out that social problems have to be sexy. They need drama, they need novelty, they need to be bright in the public eye, and they need to carry a lot of emotional weight. And if you're ever going to get anybody to pay any attention, you need to have these components. Well, when was the last time you heard somebody talk about human irrationality in dramatic, novel, vivid, emotional terms? I mean, it's almost counterintuitive. It doesn't fit that bill. And when you look at the social, a big issue right now, the detention centers where immigrant children are being held in immigrant families, that has the emotional vividness, the drama, the novelty on both sides, on the left and the right. And the reason both sides are getting a lot of mileage out of it is because it's emotionally salient. We have to stop those evil immigrants from crossing our borders. That's emotionally salient. We have to stop these innocent children from being punished for no good reason and separated from. That's emotionally salient. So it gets on the board rather easily. That doesn't happen with irrationality. Okay, so that's the first one. That is this competition for public attention that's simply not happening. The second reason has to do with the way our brains work. And that is there are a lot of impediments just inside us to getting irrationality to be important. You guys are probably aware of Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I'm sure a number of you have read it. And he presents a model, and in that model, there are just certain things that default to a type of thinking that's quick and heuristic and emotional. And in fact, our brains tend to go right to quick and dirty solutions and not go into system 2 thinking, the red head over there, where we have to be slow and deliberative and spend a lot of resources to think about things. And so consequently, our brains just default to this mode of give me a quick and dirty answer. Well, that, of course, you can recognize, that is system 1 thinking that aligns with drama and novelty. In other words, if the problem is a system 2 problem and our brains default to system 1 type processes, there's not a good chance we're going to make this consistently important in the public eye. Another problem is the way that human beings handle evidence. Here, for example, is the percentage of people who belong to the Tea Party who believe that President Obama was born outside the U.S. Now, before the birth certificate was made public, approximately 30% of Tea Party members thought that President Obama was born outside the United States. After the birth certificate was produced, that number went up to 45. I don't know why. Don't ask me that question. I have no idea. The answer is because we don't deal with contrary evidence very, very well. And so imagine if you thought you were a rational person and there was evidence presented to you that you were not irrational. Your belief that you were rational would go up. So you can see how that relates to the idea of it not making its way into the public sphere. Next, we have a problem called self-enhancement biases. Now, self-enhancement biases are basically when we think too highly of ourselves. Notice who's on top there. I am a better professor than most professors. That comes in at about 96% of professors think they're better than average. And then the famous one is the I'm a better driver than most. You can only be a better driver than most means the top 50%, right? And yet 90% of people think that they are a better driver than most. And then you skip down to the fourth one, and most people think I am more rational than most. About 80% of people think they're more rational than other people. And so try convincing that crowd that they're really in the 20%, not in the 80%. And then my favorite, a term that I got from a famous article by, Kruger and Dunning, I think was the name. Yeah, you know that article, huh? Good. The term is unavoidable reality constraint. I love that term. Algebra and calculus teach us this because algebra, a lack of a knowledge of algebra, is an unavoidable reality constraint to being able to do calculus. No one in the right mind says, sure, I can do calculus. I never passed algebra, but it shouldn't be a problem for me. No one says that. But if you give them a task that requires quite a lot of rationale, a lot of thinking, a lot of logic, they think they can do it without any training whatsoever. And so rationality lacks that unavoidable reality constraint of saying, you've never really had the training to be able to think through this problem yourself. Maybe the amateurs should clear the floor and let the pros take over. So that is another problem with getting this into the public sphere, because people think they already have it. So consequently, we have some mismatches. And that is, this is a System 2 problem being solved by people using System 1 resources who don't particularly assess their own rational abilities well, who aren't willing to admit their own irrationality, who tend to reject negative things like, perhaps you're being irrational about this. And finally, they don't want to admit that this is a learned skill because they think if you can think well. That's rather like thinking if you can run fast. And of course, that's not true. The next item concerns technological solutions. And by that I mean sort of an over-reliance on technology to solve all problems. Read this quote from Luke Dormel from his book, The Formula, which is a really terrific book. Now that is first-class intellectual chutzpah, don't you think? It can do anything. Now, I'm all for the advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence. They've brought us great advances in areas like counterterrorism and medical diagnostics. That's terrific. However, There are times when technological solutionism just oversteps its bounds. If you haven't read an article called Faith in the Algorithm Part 2 by a guy named Marco Rodriguez, you should. I'm going to show you a scary quote from this article about the extent of technological solutionism and how far it can go. Now, here's what I tell my students after I show this slide. If you read that and you didn't say, "Holy crap," you didn't read it. Because that really shows the hopes for technological solutionism. Just give us enough data and we'll figure out how to make you happy. You just step aside. We'll take care of this. We'll make sure that you're happy. Now, I'm not talking about happiness, obviously. I'm talking about the problem of rationality and irrationality. And so I want to draw that quote into the next point. It is absolutely true that machines can outperform us. They're really, really good at being logical. But notice what the next step is logically. If we really believe that we can rely on these machines, look at the consequence. Irrationality doesn't matter anymore. Someone will write an app for that. And so if you ignore it on that level, eventually it gets completely ignored and this thing starts to shrink. The fourth point, my favorite part, is that there's a confusion that we all make between irrationality and lack of intelligence or rationality and intelligence. And that's because of an old question that you guys have heard 100 times. Why do smart people sometimes do dumb things? Now, when you think about that question, people have been asking that as long as recorded history. Aristotle was asking, why do smart people do dumb things? Thomas Aquinas was asking, why do smart people do dumb things? 3,000 years of philosophers asking, why do smart people do dumb things? And do you know what the answer has been for 3,000 years by the finest minds in Western civilization? I don't know. Until about 30 years ago, when a guy named Keith Stanovich started investigating this problem. I'm going to skip that one because I want to get to Stanovich. In 1993, Keith Stanovich, who's a researcher at the University of Toronto, wrote an article on a principle that he called disrationality. That's the definition that he gave. That is, you can think and act rationally, but you just don't do it, whether you choose not to or something. This led to about 30 years of research into the field of disrationality. And he produced 4 books, which are absolutely marvelous. Unfortunately, he doesn't know how to write a title, and consequently, What Intelligence Tests Miss, which is brilliant, nobody reads because who would read a book titled What Intelligence Tests Miss? But if you want to go right to the heart of it, read the 3rd book, Rationality and the Reflective Mind, tremendously challenging and beautiful book that will explain a lot of the principles that are coming in the next couple of slides. Stanovich's conclusion after about 30 years of research was that intelligence and rationality do not equate, that they are in fact separate entities that can be measured in completely different ways. And consequently, because no one knows that, that gets ignored. Educators ignore it, policymakers ignore it, lawmakers ignore it. And this is roughly equivalent to making the mistake of confusing two things that are not supposed to be confused. So the idea, further, is that if these two things are the same, we don't need to teach anybody to be rational. We just need to educate them Teach them to be more intelligent, to have more knowledge, and they will be more rational. And that is, in fact, not the case at all, and that is not what happens. In fact, it's equivalent to comparing health and fitness, and we all know what happened to James Fix, right? The long-distance runner who was in perfect shape and collapsed because heart was bad. Now, we start talking about solutions, because we're moving now into education. If educators are ignoring this, that clearly is a problem. Because what educators do is they focus on content. They try to disseminate knowledge, and the assumption is if we can give you enough knowledge, you're going to be able to be more intelligent. That must mean that you're more rational, and that is absolutely unconditionally not true. In a way, you can't blame educators, though, because we don't have any diagnostic tools. We don't have any measures of rationality. The best we have are standardized tests that measure progress in a particular discipline, which is completely inadequate. This is exacerbated by some problems that Richard Paul found, that college educators, in fact, don't even know what critical thinking is. He found 90% of Cal State University professors said that they taught critical thinking on a daily basis. He found 8% of them could give a definition of critical thinking. That's a type mismatch. So they don't even know that they lack the knowledge, unfortunately, and consequently they return to what it is they know best, which is knowledge dissemination. Get you to have knowledge, increase your intelligence, you're going to be more rational. What Stanovich recommends is that we start thinking of rationality in terms of mindware modules. I'll let you read that. So in the same way that we teach a discipline like mathematics or accounting in a step-by-step fashion, we show people to do things one step at a time, there are modules to rationality. And what we should be thinking about in terms of educating our children are, what are these particular pieces that we can contribute to their intellectual growth? For example, anytime you're teaching the scientific method, you're teaching rationality. Anytime you're teaching statistical or probabilistic reasoning, you're teaching rationality. The fourth bullet point, when you're teaching how to discern whether or not something is true or false, you are teaching evaluative reasoning. But these need to be targeted as individual skills in order to make progress. And so, in summary, the 5 reasons why it is that irrationality as a problem and rationality as a goal is not making its way into the public eye as it should, once again, is because this doesn't feel like a normal social problem. Our challenge is to make it feel like a normal social problem. It's because there are ways that the brain works that get in the way. It's our job as educators of every type, not just the ones who are in the classroom, to help young people learn about these impediments within their own thinking. Third, we need to be very wary of solutions that circumvent the human brain, hacks, in order to provide us with answers that we don't truly understand how we got to them. Fourth, we need to make a really big deal educationally out of the absolute, incontrovertible fact that intelligence and rationality are very different things. It needs to be an educational goal starting today. And finally, we need to make sure that schools have the educational wherewithal, the teachers have the training to be able to train things like statistical reasoning, the scientific method, critical thinking in every classroom, not just in physics class or philosophy class. Thank you very much.